Okay, this is really an opportunity for us to have a little bit more discussion from the floor, because we haven't quite had the chance to do that as we would like to have done so far. So if there are any questions that people would like to raise for our various speakers, then please put your hand up and wait for the microphone to reach you.
Specifically psychoanalytic question here. Specifically Lacanian psychoanalytic. Specifically psychoanalytic question, specifically Lacanian question here. The one thing that hasn't been mentioned this morning, and I missed yesterday's session, so I was travelling, so I only just got here today. May have come up yesterday. Quick question. Where does Jacques Lacan's category of the real fit into this? Because I find that kind of quite helpful in terms of understanding femininity. There's this idea that femininity is, on the one hand, kind of obedient, reproductive, and so on and so forth, maternal. But then on the other hand, there's this other model of femininity which is actually profoundly transgressive and disruptive, and that occurs in the category of the real. And that hasn't really been discussed yet. So any thoughts anybody has on that would be most gratefully received.
Who would like to respond to that?
That's the real. The thing.
It'll return to the same place, it's fine.
It's Slavoj.
I was just going to say that because the real is beyond signification, is very difficult to address directly. I will say that in my presentation on Bracha Ettinger, she does deal with the notion of the other sexual difference as a real difference, and that is a capital R real difference, and something that can also be somatized. And so certainly in her work, she approaches the notion of the real as trying to get at a dimension of experience or a dimension of being that I think, actually, as Juliet so eloquently put in her presentation and discussion, we yet have language to capture. There's always something in excess of what can be said and imagined. And I think that one of the strengths of trans psychoanalytic theory is that it pushes us to think about or engage something having to do with what is not yet known or fully understood, which has to do with being.
And maybe just to add to Sheila's, I think if one could read the emphasis on the matricial model, that one of the things I learned from the clinical practice is that what seems to be an issue of gender, in fact, is a question of life and death. And that maybe could account from the very worrisome incidence of suicide. If we can trust the statistics, there is supposedly a 41% rate of suicidal attempts among those identified as trans, as opposed to between 3 and 5% in the general population. So there is something about this border between life and death, the real. And this is, for instance, there was a clip yesterday morning from a television show. There is always this, there is a sort of genre in interviews to trans people, and there was this interview, but you were born, and there is a pause, girl. And I would stop there, but you were born. And I think maybe the matrix has to do with issues of existence, birth, coming into the world, knowing that if we came into the world, we'll exit it. And I think is something that Simon Critchley has said, like, I have very bad news to tell you, to everybody in the room, you're going to die. And everybody, you laugh. But I have witnessed that. Everybody goes, oh! So the real, there you have it.
So I just said that if you go to the museum, you'll notice the death mask at the end of the couch, which is Freud's little joke, exactly that. Yeah.
Damien has a question. Can the microphone find its way to Damien, please?
I think a lot of what's been talked about this morning sort of plays in my mind in relation to an assessment I was asked to do of a young teenage boy who had presented having self-harmed at hospital. And I was presented with this young boy with 2 heavily bandaged wrists following deep cuts. And this is the site of contemporary psychoanalysis, and I just wondered about the site of pathology, where it really lies, and what our response to it is, because, of course, what I was presented with was a young lad who identified as bisexual, and, of course, as we've been talking about the relation between gender and sexuality and gender, you know, this boy was being pathologized as someone rather than the representation of a pathology that was coming from outside, because the real cause of his distress and disturbance and wish to die was rooted in the school. And so I suppose one of the questions I have is how we reach, as psychoanalysts, psychotherapists, practitioners, how we reach from outside the consulting room into these other settings, like a school setting, where there's real pathology and real damage to psyche and soma and everything else.
Yeah, I'd quite like to talk about that for a moment. I talked earlier about reading a lot of, just being sort of generally interested in radical left approaches to pretty much everything. And of course, one approach you've often found in those circles to psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, any sort of intervention between, a patient, an analyst and an analysand, is a sort of a reluctance to talk sufficiently about social context and about the way the world is shaped sort of ideologically and the effect that has on the individual subject. And I don't think that's a structural problem with that approach. Conversations between analysts and analysands can very much and should bring those perspectives in. And I think it's, in the context you've just talked about, I think it's incredibly important to talk about school. I really wish I could find it, but there is a W.H. Auden quote somewhere where he says if you wanted to damage as many people as possible, you couldn't do better than a school. Like, you really... But he's right, like, hands up anyone for whom school was the happiest time of their life. Right, okay. One brave person at the front here. Someone at the back. Right, yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I do think it's very important to bring in those sort of wider social perspectives. And does that mean that all kind of psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic intervention should come from a radical perspective? Some would say yes, but I do think any intervention that doesn't take into account those contexts is just fundamentally flawed.
I was just making the remark that the institution of education is an ongoing, trans-historical maybe, scene of the absolute removal of agency from children. That is a form of bodily modification, all kinds of harm, including self-harm, and that Henry hadn't mentioned it in his schema.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I had to make choices, and I did not. I did not mention any of the contexts. School is one context. I would say the family is another context, going back to Lacanian critiques of family, for instance. And then society is the other big context and culture, and for any decent analysis and doing justice to it, you need to look at all of them. And school plus university is very, very important in that. Couldn't agree more.
Well, the reason I'm making this obvious point is that there was a discourse of agency in the room that was didn't seem psychoanalytic and wasn't very self-conscious about these large social institutions that are not premised on autonomy.
Yeah, it is easily possible to think far too simplistically about agency and seeing that as an individual, atomistic thing, rather than as people inside systems. I think the systems view is very important there. and sort of the wider context and how that works together. And there is always a bit of a danger with many schools of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis to ignore the wider context and the systems that things operate and happen in.
Can I just push this a bit further? Because I think what I'm asking is something more than this, something much more aggressive. Because I work with young people and they come and they talk about the damage that's being done through being different and wanting to talk about difference, and particularly in religious schools, the way in which they are shut down. And so I suppose what I'm appealing to is a sort of model beyond the consulting room, which is that these institutions need our thinking, they need our minds in there. And maybe there's a collusion that we go on with anti-bullying policies and everybody's fine because that box is ticked. But I can tell you now it's not working.
I just want to pick up small point and I'll let another speak. I mean, you used the word system, and I want to draw attention to the pun in that. System. Systems of heteronormativity and cisgenders, and I'll let the other speakers respond to that.
The only other thought that I wanted to add is certainly years ago, Michelle Fine wrote a very interesting piece called The Missing Discourse of Desire in Sex Education. And I think there's a lot in that. And she would talk about how girls, young girls in particular, would write in the bathroom wall. And, you could read the graffiti and there would be a whole range of inscriptions having to do with love and hate and the body and gender and sexuality. And it does get foreclosed in education. And I think that is actually, unfortunately, one of the functions of education, to adhere to a kind of biopolitics of health and wellness. And I certainly commend and support the gay and trans positive education programs that get initiated. But I also really worry about the normative structure built into what we recognize as a healthy gay or a healthy trans lifestyle. And I think education as a discipline as a whole hasn't been very open to questions about desire, jouissance, and the unconscious. And we can see that insofar as most psychoanalytic thinking, it seems to me, happens in psychoanalytic institutes independent of the university. So it seems to me that a lot of the disciplinary boundaries and the way in which we structure discourse and what can be said and asked in each context plays a big part in the foreclosure of knowledge and intellectual thinking.
Although, I would add that, by the time you get to university, an awful lot of damage has been done by the exclusion of these, it was all very well for me finding out about Magnus Hirschfeld and, all this other stuff when I was an undergrad, but I needed these perspectives when I was sort of 13. But, such is the nature of sort of public discussions around children, teenagers, gender and sexuality, the depth of and the fury of opposition that you will come up against if you sort of bring those sorts of conversations anywhere near a secondary school, is a real problem. And I haven't come up with a way around it, and I haven't seen anyone who has really. These interventions need to be a lot earlier, and I don't know how we do that.
Claudia at the back has a question. Can the microphone find its way towards her, please?
Could I say one more thing?
I had a question too. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Does all this, and also the remark of Damien, not open the question of what to do with all these institutions, the family, the school, the psychiatric institutions? Can we just say that we have to do away with them, like in anti-psychiatry in the Times? Or should we say, as a lot of thinkers, French thinkers also, told that the patient, one of the patients is the institution, so we have to do therapy with the institutions, like all the movement of psychothérapie institutionnelle, institutional psychotherapy claims, as you can see, for instance, in Laborde, where the therapy of the psychiatric institution, but also in the schools, is a claim of the psychoanalyst.
Yeah, this is what's really fits with one extra where I was going to go about Damien's question too. I mean, education and family seem to be pretty inescapable, and they are probably the two biggest sort of institutional contexts. And there has been some critique of that. I mean, Ivan Illich in the 1970s trying to say, let's go away from schooling, let's go away from education. But probably in realistic practice, children will be educated and spend vast amounts of time in educational institutions. That is why important forces in society, especially religion and religious groups, and especially also capitalism and neoliberal groups and groups that are profit motivated, always make it their business to get a lot of influence on educational systems. And that is, I think, at least partly where the problem lies. But it is difficult to fight back against that. It is very, very difficult, but it needs to be done, and everyone needs to take that on. And we can do, as Julian said, a certain amount sort of later on with adults and a certain amount at university, but it would be better if also school counselors, the more school counselors, for instance, there would be, and the more they would be conscious of these things, the better it would be.
But there are groups of psychoanalysts, but I don't know if they are well known in the Netherlands. And in England, it is the group of the psychothérapie institutionnelle, the group of Jean Houry, Deleuze, Guattari, but they are actual, alive and kicking. It are very big groups in France. So you have to Google and look for the formation.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is a question about origin myths and that sort of thing, and everyone's been attacking school and the institution and all these. I had a lovely time at school. It was great fun. Also, if we're talking about origin myths and how much they can be used in psychoanalytic practice, and a lot of sessions today have talked about that, and yesterday about origin myths and how they can be used, particularly in trans issues. What's to say that these same origin myths, and this is to do with the religion question, what's to say that those same origin myths can't be used for an internal masochism? So you have origin myths that are used and developed to show who we are as people and individuals, but who's to say that we ourselves, and I'm talking from a very positive approach to these institutions, that we ourselves don't manipulate them to our own disadvantage, to our own to prevent ourselves from flourishing?
I was thinking it's interesting, maybe because we are talking about discontent in culture, or that we move on to questioning the institution, and maybe what we need to be reminded is that psychoanalysis is above all a practice. And as soon as psychoanalysts get together and it becomes an institution, it's no longer psychoanalytic, strictly speaking. And it's always problematic, from the very early days of Freud, exchanging rings, to the long history of exclusion of not MDs from the International Psychoanalytic, to maybe the pedagogical bent, because we are talking about education, and I agree with Sheila that desire and jouissance is excluded, but what can one teach about desire or jouissance? Maybe leave the space for that to emerge, but it's not something that can be transmitted as a pedagogical program. I don't think it's... If not, we enter into what Foucault has very rightfully criticized, and we transform maybe psychoanalytic language and knowledge into a tool for control and punishment. So I think maybe we need to be aware of the danger that, in a way, as psychoanalysts, we have a responsibility, and that's what I try to denounce by looking at the history of the pathologization of psychoanalysis of non-normative expressions of sexuality, as if there would be such a thing as normal sexuality. So there are all these delusional ideas of normalcy and pedagogical models, but I think to be a psychoanalyst, there is an ethical position in which, to start with, the analyst doesn't know anything. When you have a patient coming into the office, if you position yourself as the person who knows, you're not positioning yourself as an analyst. And that is indeed something that has been thought of by Lacan as docta ignorantia, that in a way you, following Nicolas Cusanus, one of course has studied things. That's why paradoxically many psychoanalytic institutions gather under the signifier school. So again, we fall back into the pedagogical model. But the idea is that one starts any new encounter with an analysand not knowing. The analysand doesn't know either, assumes that the analyst knows, but it's a supposition of a knowledge that doesn't exist. And it may be produced in the interaction of analyst and analysand, and it will reside in the unconscious of the analysand. And then the analyst will fall from that position, and the analysis will end. So I think it's complicated to talk about a pedagogical program from a psychoanalytic perspective. That's all.
I'm going to have to be the Lacanian analyst here and cut our session short, but there's a effect. Hopefully we will remember better, and we can return to this discussion later. To pick up on the Foucault reference, the order of things now is that we're going to be breaking until 2:30 for some lunch. Yes, and we can have some discipline and punishment.